welcome to Haarlem and welcome to ICPR 2024, our 6th edition already. This is a conference on psychedelics. And psychedelics are amplifiers, catalysts. Catalysts for change, including cultural and societal change. We will explore social aspects, cultural phenomena. We'll take a look at the economic side of things, touching upon religious, spiritual, and existential dimensions, confronting some of the most profound experiences that we go through as humans. We dissect the latest insights from clinical trials. We listen to the wisdom of elders who come from a long lineage of using plant medicines. We discuss thorny ethical issues, consider legal perspectives, try to disentangle the forces trying to steer this field in different directions. We study health aspects. We appreciate aesthetic dimensions. We try to figure out what happens inside the minds and brains and neurons of humans and other animals when their conscious experience is altered. And ultimately, we try to make sense of what it all means. Big questions.
How would you define what psychedelics are and what are the categories of psychedelics?
Psychedelics are drugs that cause an altered state of consciousness. This large category includes drugs like LSD and magic mushrooms and DMT and ayahuasca and mescaline. Those are typically called the serotonin psychedelics, but it also includes in that category drugs like ibogaine, MDMA, and ketamine. And so the terminology that I favor is that while all of them are psychedelics, they can be subdivided based on similarities in the acute subjective effects. So for example, MDMA is different from other psychedelics in that it induces this empathogenic quality or this pro-social quality. Ibogaine is thought of as an onirogenic psychedelic because it induces a sort of dreamlike state. Ketamine and PCP, these are psychedelics that induce a dissociative state. And then LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, these are hallucinogenic psychedelics.
Could you explain us the neurobiological mechanisms of how psychedelics work and how do they affect the brain?
All right, so the discovery that my lab made is that psychedelics seem to be what we call the master keys for unlocking something called critical periods. So critical periods are these windows of time where the brain is especially sensitive to its environment and able to learn in lasting ways from that environment. So most people will be familiar with the notion of a critical period when they think about how hard it is to learn a second language as an adult compared to how they learned their first language as a child. If psychedelics really are the master keys for unlocking critical periods, it would explain why they're also effective in so many different disorders of the brain.
According to the World Health Organization, 1 in every 8 people worldwide live with a mental disorder. Although effective treatment options exist, for a large group of patients, the current treatments and medications are inadequate. More research is needed into the therapeutic application of psychedelics, and we all want that application to be proven effective. Of course, the development of psychedelic-assisted therapy needs to follow the standard model of development of a medicinal product. This means that clinical trials need to be done before applying for marketing authorization in the European Union.
Can you tell your personal stories, how psychedelics changed your lives?
I was first diagnosed with depression in 1998 and put on SSRIs as a first-line treatment. They were really helpful in a point of crisis, and they helped stabilize things. But unfortunately, depression returns. We just changed the SSRI, try a different talk therapy. And that pattern ensued for like the next 20 years. Psychedelics have given me an insight into myself, changed my relationship to depression, and inspired me to make sure that other people have access to these same treatments. And that was a really intense experience. DMT is quite a profound thing. Intravenous DMT, possibly even more so because it had extended duration. And it was a particularly visceral experience for me of my body, of my felt sense. And post that trial, I think a lot of my healing work has come from somatic practices. I do a lot of dancing now. Beauty is such a value that's come into my life post that experience, and trying to treat myself with love and compassion and those around me.
I've taken part in 2 clinical trials looking at the use of psilocybin on treatment-resistant depression. I got to a place where I was more able to deal with the range of emotions I was feeling, because depression for me was about resisting feelings, resisting thoughts, pushing them away. I felt lighter, things looked brighter, you know, going out in nature, everything sort of seemed to be shining back at me, not like a hallucination, but just everything felt more alive, you know. So I've been off antidepressants for the last 5 years now, following that trial. And yeah, it's not always easy. It's not a magic cure or anything like that, but I'm definitely in a better place.
So psychedelics are the master key, but what do they do in the brain?
What my lab has discovered is that the way that the psychedelics seem to be working is that when they bind to the receptors, when that happens, it triggers a set of cellular changes that causes the extracellular matrix, which is this protein-sugar complex that surrounds the synapses. It causes that to dissolve, and that enables the cell to reorganize its synaptic weights and restores plasticity to an adult brain. For the last 50 or so years, neuropsychiatric treatments have been based on a model of disease that's sort of a biochemical imbalance model of disease. And so if you're depressed, it's because you have a biochemical imbalance in serotonin, and all we have to do to make you undepressed is to restore that balance, right? And I think really what the psychedelics are doing is challenging that entire model of disease, because people are essentially taking psychedelics, having a experience that enables to learn something about how their disease process manifests, change that learned habit that they've built around that injury, and then they are essentially reporting that the disease is cured, right? And it's not 100% cure in 100% of people, but it's a very different model, a learning model of disease rather than a biochemical imbalance model.
Do you have any theory about how psychedelics treat OCD, which is an acronym for obsessive compulsive disorder?
I do clinical research, primarily with psilocybin, and we study it in OCD populations and depressed populations. So OCD is obsessive thoughts that are distressing to them, that cause a significant time in their day. And then it can include, but doesn't have to include, a compulsive action by which they do to try to relieve themselves of these thoughts. We had one participant that would spend 12 hours in the bathroom until she felt that she was clean enough to come out of the bathroom. And so at least in our clinical trials, this is like kind of like a last resort for them, because they've actually tried everything else. Really wondering if this could be something that, for those who are refractory to other treatments, could this really help them get unstuck? Like, all of our participants are stuck in some manner. Our psychedelic drug for the OCD population was psilocybin. Our study shows that for some it is helpful. Like for roughly about 75% of our population that we did, 2 days later, most people, even the ones that didn't respond later on, had a reduction in symptoms at 48 hours and actually at 1 week. What we see though is that 25% of our participants after that 1 week mark had a return of their OCD symptoms. So it either became the same, at the level same, or even worse.
Do psychedelics have a potential to treat addiction?
Absolutely. Now there are good studies with psilocybin, with ketamine, and they show very much promising. What the idea is about psychedelics, that they can reduce the strict organization in the brain, the compulsivity, the compulsive thinking, ruminating all the time, walking the same cognitive, emotional path in your brain. The compulsive feeling of craving, always thinking about, I want to have the drug, even if I don't enjoy it so much anymore. And so what the promise is for psychedelics in the treatment of patients with addiction now is that they shake up the existing very strict, inflexible ways of thinking and behaving and experiencing. Within, I would say, anywhere between 3 and 5 years, we will have a registered medication there.
What are the new research frontiers for MAPS?
MDMA for couples therapy is one of the areas that we want to look at. The other part that's going to be really interesting for MAPS to work on with MDMA is global humanitarian projects. And one of the things that's so exciting for me about that is going to be working with refugees and migrants who've been traumatized kind of in families, and to think about treating people in groups but with parents and children together. MAPS is very interested in ibogaine research, but I do not want to do it in a traditional way with investors. A lot of what we're doing is drug policy research. MAPS is also doing work with cannabis right now, and we have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study cannabis for PTSD in veterans. We're talking about MDMA for conflict resolution, not just couples therapy, but from cultures, people at war with each other, to help them see their common humanity. So there's just going to be an enormous amount of things that MAPS, the nonprofit, is going to continue to do.
Can you explain to people how psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is different from traditional talking therapy?
Working with psychedelics is not talk therapy plus psychedelics. It's a third type of work that melds the benefit of the psychedelics influence on the person as well as on the therapist. There's a relationship the client has with the psychedelic that the therapist has with the psychedelic, and then that the therapist and client have together. That's a different way of working than just with regular psychotherapy. So what we train on psychedelics is that you are, as the therapist, supporting the work of the person who is using the psychedelic. You're not showing them the way, you're not directing them, you're not using a very rigid model. That's what's typical right now, but there is a burgeoning interest, and as well there should be, in something called psycholytic psychotherapy, which is lower dose. You can be talking with one another. The person is opening up into affect and cognitions that they wouldn't usually, and it opens people up to being able to scrutinize and feel material in themselves and talk about it at the same time. And that is more directive.
When you are on psychedelics, there are many difficult, challenging experiences. So how can we deal with those experiences?
I suppose be honest with people that it's kind of more like a skydive or a deep sea dive or a emotional roller coaster, rather than the brain reset analogies, which I think make people think it's like a passive thing. You go in, you get your brain reset, you come out, and in fact, it's such an engaged process a lot of the time. So being really honest with people about what they're like, and then having just really good training for therapists so that they're really able to support well. And then my biggest passion is around community integration, because so often with adverse events, they arise months afterwards, so they don't really sometimes come up in the session or like just afterwards, but people usually have a bit of an afterglow. It's usually a few months later that the issues that may have come up, psychological issues that may have come up in those difficult experiences, tend to resurface, and then they're left without any care. So it's how can we build community structures of integration and support so that people aren't left alone, aren't kind of abandoned after these experiences, so that if difficult stuff comes up again, they're supported to process it.
Why did you feel the need to create an organization for patients?
Actually, what we found after doing the psychedelic trials, that sometimes you come out feeling even more lonely and even more isolated because you've been through such a profound experience. You might return to families, social networks that don't understand what you've been through.
The idea was very much to create a community of people like ourselves, because then you have so much more lived experience and knowledge that you can then use, learn from. Organisations providing these trials and treatments can therefore weave that lived experience through the trial process.
There are many patients who are desperately waiting for having legal access to psychedelic treatment. but there are also people who say that we move too fast and we need to ensure ethical standards and the evidence base. How can we find a balance between the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's nearly 10 years since I took part in my first clinical trial, and my hope was that by now these treatments, if proved to be effective, would be widely available and accessible to people. But with all of that said, I think it's really important that we do this in the right way. If we do this right, I think there are many people whose suffering can be alleviated by these treatments. If we get it wrong, these treatments will never become available. I think it's really important to say as well that those people like ourselves who have responded to these treatments need to have what's called compassionate access to the treatments on an ongoing basis afterwards. If you can imagine being in a hole for 20, 30 years, you find something that helps you. It's not a miracle, you need therapy around it, you need help, you need to do integration. Something finally lifts that cloud, and then the only way you can access that again is to break the law.
Psychedelic treatment is a hybrid form of treatment between talking therapy and pharmacological treatment. Do you think it will find its way in mainstream medical care?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we will see a diversity in practices. As we are seeing today, there's a lot of underground movement. There's ayahuasca retreats, psilocybin retreats. People are using these substances already in diverse ways. I think that it's a matter of finding how this will be implemented in the medical system. Who is going to be administering that? What sort of training will people need to administer it? How cheap or how expensive this is going to be? Who's going to be able to access these treatments? Is this something that's going to be paid by the social security or the national health systems, or it's going to be something that is private? So I think that there's a lot of caveats there. And countries like Canada or Australia, in which these treatments can be prescribed, they are still struggling to find a way of how to make it happen.
Neuropsychopharmacological drug development got into a deep crisis around 2010. Basically, all the big pharmaceutical corporations have withdrawn from central nervous system drug development since then, and they have not re-engaged. The only class of substances that has attracted a lot of attention and that inspired optimism in the past decade were basically psychedelics. And that often went along with the idea of a paradigm shift in psychiatric treatment, that you would combine pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. And of course, psychotherapy is, a certain kind of setting in which you're working on people's mindset. And there is no controlled trial that would control for the therapy component. All the trials that we have seen so far are placebo-controlled trials that compare drug with placebo, but not, giving drug to both arms while, giving them therapy or no therapy, or giving them cognitive behavioral therapy versus psychoanalysis, or whatever you would want to compare. And then there is the regulatory problem that all the regulatory agencies are tasked with regulating drugs, not psychotherapies, and they don't know how to deal with that.
Our general goal is to provide the information that payers are going to need to understand what do these therapies cost and how is it going to affect healthcare utilization over time. Without the economic analysis, psychedelic therapies will be very nice for a few people who can afford to pay for it, and they will have no public health impact. The potential will not be fulfilled. We're seeing early, very positive signals. So MDMA for PTSD, not only cost-effective, but highly cost-saving. Psilocybin for depression, also positive, less dramatically so, but also very positive. And we've also published on the economics of group psychedelic sessions as opposed to individual sessions. Very important, not just to reduce costs, but to increase access. Because with group therapy, each trained clinician can reach more people.
By reading your articles, I had the feeling that you are an archaeologist and you would like to dig up something which many in the psychedelic movement would today rather bury.
Yeah,
Is that right?
I sometimes feel that way, absolutely. There's a very complicated relationship now between the mainstream and the underground, and part of it involves the mainstream rejecting some of these stories, and the classic example is Tim Leary. It's easier for a CEO of a psychedelic pharmaceutical company to praise indigenous wisdom than it is to acknowledge that Tim Leary got some things right, because he has to play the role of the bad guy who destroyed legitimate science and took it away, which is absurd. Science did not stop with the scheduling of psychedelics. In fact, there was tons of research that was happening by countercultural people with illegal materials and developing a lot of knowledge.
The main idea of the psychedelic renaissance was a break with the counterculture and to bring psychedelics into the culture, and that means into cultural institutions, and cultural institutions are rule governed. And that means you have to find a space for these wild substances in a rule-governed world, and I think that's part of the drama that's playing out. And if you think about the Western psychedelic culture, I mean, it has mostly been recreational uses, hedonistic uses, spiritual uses. The medical uses are part of the picture, but not the key part. They have become the key part now in the psychedelic renaissance, because we live in societies that value health more than anything else, and that is why biomedicalization has become the driving force of the psychedelic renaissance. There would be no psychedelic renaissance without biomedicalization. And if biomedicalization fails, I would predict that the psychedelic renaissance will collapse. And collapsing means we go back to underground use where people do whatever they want to do and risk punishment, or there is a decriminalized world in which, you know, these uses are tolerated and they will just do it at their own risk.
Psychedelics are a technology. Every technology creates risks and benefits. Think of cars or knives or artificial intelligence. And in applied ethics, the goal is really to optimize the risk-benefit ratio with an perspective for the common good. And that's what every government in the free world, every democratic government is actually obliged to do. It's a duty of care for the state to maximize the risk-benefit ratio of new technologies. I mean, psilocybin is an old technology of humankind, but now we have many new molecules. So governments should, for instance, resist commodification. They should resist billionaires moving in and commercializing the field.
Around 300 million or so has been donated to nonprofits in the last almost 40 years. But around $4 billion has been invested in the last 4 years in for-profit psychedelic companies. So yes, most of that is traditional profit companies, and I think we have to be very wary of how that shakes out, because there's an emphasis on reducing the cost of the therapy. The pharma companies don't make money on the therapy, they make money on the drugs. So they're going to want to have as big a price for the drug as possible and minimize the therapy. That's something, a caution that we have to. So I think the fact that there is so much investor money means that we need to think carefully about how this goes forward. But for me, the corresponding balancing point is drug policy reform. You know, how do we make it so people have access outside of medicine, outside of religion, for preventative medicine, personal growth, personal healing, working with their friends on issues. You don't always need to go to trained professionals. So I think the drug policy reform will be a sort of a check on the capitalism that's moving forward.
Ethan, how do you see the role of psychedelics in the larger landscape of drug policy reform?
The fact that cannabis reform and legalization has been so rapidly followed, more rapidly than any of us expected, by progress on psychedelics reform and some elements of decriminalization regulation, I think that creates a feeling of momentum in terms of broader drug policy reform. Now, I think there's still an unfortunate divide where so many people in the psychedelics field are utterly uninterested in the rest of drug policy reform, except maybe the marijuana piece, and where so many people involved in traditional drug policy reform, whether you're talking about harm reduction and overdose, or whether you're talking about arrest and incarceration or racial injustice, kind of look askance or are not participating sufficiently in the broader area of psychedelics reform. But I think that divide has narrowed somewhat.
What would be the optimal regulation for non-medical use of psychedelics?
You know, I'm not a right-wing libertarian. I don't say automatically sell all this stuff over the counter without any restrictions, the way we're now selling alcohol, tobacco, or I mean, there's restrictions, but where it's still legally available to adults. But I think we need to come up with different models. Over the years, people have proposed some kind of test, you know, that you would need to pass, like the way you have to take a test to get your driver's license. So maybe you pass a test to get your psychedelics use license or your other drug use license. You know, long time ago, I suggested the idea that if you allowed a market whereby people could go pick up their drug at a pharmacy and they would not necessarily need a doctor's prescription, but what would pop up would be a screen at where you pay, and the pharmacist would not be allowed to give you the substance until you had answered all 10 questions correctly. And you could take the test as many times as you want. But it would be a form of pushing people, incentivizing people to learn what they needed to learn, basic harm reduction information about the safer rather than more risky forms of psychedelic use.
So here's a thought that relates to the question about how psychedelics might move in better ways into the culture. And it has to do with the value of community. There's a lot to be said for the tempering quality of having powerful experiences held by a community of people, preferably age diverse, including elders, and with some stability to it. A community maybe where some people leave and some people come into it, but there's a stable core. It's used by people who are friends, you might say friend circles. It's used by communities of people who come together periodically, and not necessarily with a religious frame, although sometimes with a religious frame. And the general agreement in a community like that would be, we help each other, and in particular, we give each other permission to give feedback that might be uncomfortable to give and uncomfortable to receive, but we're all better off if we do that with each other in a loving way with an intention to help.
Can you shortly explain us what were the findings of the Johns Hopkins study?
Sure. So the first study was published in 2006. The most impressive thing to us was that about a third of the people ranked their psilocybin experience, or one of them, as among the most spiritually significant and personally meaningful of their entire lives. And an additional third ranked it as the single most spiritually significant, personally meaningful of their entire lives.
What do we call a mystical type of experience?
The key distinguishing characteristic is either a sense of the external all is one, that you and the camera and the lights and the room and the bacteria and the plants outside, the plant right over there, it's all the same thing, or deeply interconnected. And there's an even stronger form of this unitive consciousness, wherein not only is it interconnected, but I'm gone, and the old I, it's all one thing. It's a vast, unbounded, living presence, awareness, and aliveness that is completely unified. That's the strongest, narrowest sense of mystical experience.
In this field, we often use terms without defining them, and one of these terms is consciousness. In your book, you write that consciousness is the appearance of the world. Can you explain this?
So there are, of course, many different concepts of consciousness. The critical one is what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, that a world subjectively appears to you. So it's more like a virtual model of reality that the organism sometimes activates to selectively elevate some of the information in the brain to global availability, that you can think about it, you can remember it, you can form a concept about it, you can attend to it. And that gives flexibility to the organism. Of course, psychedelics can tell you that light, colors, objects are absolutely not necessary in the form you experience them right now, that there are different other possibilities. But when the psychedelic experience gets deeper, you begin to realize the constructed nature of self and the constructed nature of the seeing process itself. One thing psychedelics have told me is also that there is an unfathomable depth of things which are absolutely inconceivable, things that you will not ever be able to describe in language to anybody else while it happens or afterwards, or to yourself. Just knowing about this ocean of alternate possibilities that's there all the time, that gives dignity to your life also. That adds a depth dimension to your life that can be very valuable. We have a high responsibility of developing an approach that does full justice to the depth of the beauty of it, including the spiritual quality in it, but still remains rational and evidence-based. For instance, by acknowledging that this is very likely something that happens in the brain and has to do with a very small amount of molecules. You see, these substances have also been used for millennia, and mostly in a shamanistic, religious context in which there was no culture of rational argument and evidence. This would be something historically new if we manage to find a way not only for therapy, for very few people with diseases, but for everybody, to integrate this with the openness of democratic societies and not lose the depth and the beauty of it. I don't know how to do it, but I think this is what the goal should be.